It's a very happy time. I'm happy to be back. As I said, it's my hometown.
Yes.
Well, you're a happy girl now. When you go to London? Well, Marilyn,
yes, I'm much happier though. I'm very pleased.
Marilyn Monroe is one of those figures whose public image has become so total, so saturated with myth and projection and cultural weight, that the actual person underneath it can be genuinely difficult to find. The image, the blonde hair, the breathy voice, the combination of sexual confidence and apparent fragility that made her simultaneously the most desired and the most underestimated woman of her era, has outlasted everything that made it complicated in reality. It has outlasted the intelligence she possessed and rarely received credit for. It has outlasted the ambition that drove her to build her own production company at a time when almost no actress had done anything comparable. It has outlasted the genuine literary and intellectual seriousness that led her to marry Arthur Miller and to study at the Actors Studio and to read Dostoevsky on film sets, while the people around her assumed she was not reading anything at all. What the myth has also largely outlasted is any serious accounting of her dislikes. Because Monroe is remembered primarily as a victim of the studio system, of the men in her life, of a culture that used her and then discarded her. The idea that she could have strong, specific, principled objections to specific people tends to get absorbed into the general narrative of her suffering, rather than examined on its own terms. She is grieved over more often than she is listened to, and what she actually thought about the people around her, and why she thought it, is more revealing than the simple tragedy narrative allows. She had genuine convictions about how she was supposed to be treated, as a professional, as a creative contributor, as a human being whose interior life was real, regardless of whether the people around her chose to acknowledge it. When those convictions were violated, and they were violated regularly and by many people, her response was not simply passive suffering. It was specific, remembered, and in several cases expressed with a directness that the recipients found difficult to dismiss. What follows is an honest account of 6 people who earned that response, told with the context and care the situations require. Tony Curtis is the most immediately recognizable name on this list in this specific context, because the comment he made about working with Monroe on Some Like It Hot in 1959 became one of the more quoted remarks in the history of Hollywood behind-the-scenes stories. Curtis described kissing Monroe on screen as like kissing Hitler, a statement so extreme in its expression that it drew attention primarily to its extremity rather than to the circumstances that produced it. What those circumstances actually involved deserves more careful examination than the quote alone typically receives. The production of Some Like It Hot was genuinely and seriously difficult for everyone who worked on it, and the difficulties were concentrated around Monroe's attendance patterns, her inability to deliver scripted lines within a manageable number of takes, and the atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty that surrounded her throughout the shoot. She required an extraordinary number of takes for scenes that her co-stars had completed to satisfaction much earlier, and the logistical and emotional toll of this on the production was real and documented extensively. Curtis bore a significant portion of that toll in scenes that required close physical proximity to Monroe across extended periods of repeated shooting, and his frustration by the end of the production was genuine rather than manufactured. But the specific quality of his public statement, the particular comparison he chose, the contempt embedded in it, reflected something beyond simple professional frustration. It reflected the specific way that Monroe's conduct was being read by the people around her during that period, not as the expression of genuine psychological struggle by someone who was dealing with difficulties that went well beyond simple professional unreliability, but as a form of deliberate self-indulgence by someone who was failing to honor the professional obligation she owed her co-stars. Monroe's response to this rate, as described by people close to her during the filming, was a hurt and anger that went deeper than simple professional disagreement. She felt accurately that the framing of her difficulties as willful rather than genuine was a form of erasure, a refusal to acknowledge the reality of what she was actually going through in favor of a more comfortable story in which she was simply difficult rather than struggling. The relationship between them never recovered. Curtis eventually softened his public account of the experience somewhat in later years, but the original statement had done its work, and Monroe's feelings about what it represented, the ease with which the men around her reduced her complexity to a simple category of difficulty, remained real and lasting. Laurence Olivier directed and co-starred with Monroe in The Prince and The Showgirl in 1957, and the production became one of the most extensively documented examples of catastrophic director-star relationship in the history of cinema. Olivier was at the height of his institutional authority as an actor and a director. the most celebrated Shakespearean of his generation, a figure whose cultural standing in the British theatrical world was essentially unassailable and who arrived in Hollywood for this production with an authority and a confidence that he had earned through decades of genuine achievement. Monroe arrived with Paula Strasberg, her acting coach from the Actors Studio, and with an approach to performance that was built on psychological exploration and emotional authenticity, rather than on the technical precision and external control that Olivier practiced and valued. The collision between these two approaches was immediate, fundamental, and never resolved into anything functional. Olivier found Monroe's method baffling, her reliance on Strasberg infuriating, and her inability to deliver reliable performances on a manageable schedule deeply frustrating. He made his assessment of her approach visible in ways that Monroe found both professionally offensive and personally humiliating. He reportedly told her at one point to simply try being sexy, as though the quality that made her one of the most compelling screen presences of her generation was something she could switch on and off like a technical adjustment, and that instruction, delivered in front of cast and crew, was received by Monroe as both a demonstration of his fundamental misunderstanding of her and as a deliberate act of public diminishment that she did not forgive. Monroe's response to Olivier was not simply professional frustration. It was a specific and deeply felt anger at the particular quality of his contempt, the way it assumed that her approach was simply wrong rather than different, the way it positioned his own technical tradition as the standard against which hers was measured and found deficient, and the way it failed to acknowledge the genuine quality of what she was doing on screen, even as he found the process of extracting it unbearable. People close to her during the production have described a Monroe who arrived each day having to overcome not just her own considerable personal difficulties, but also the active resistance of a director who had decided from early in the process that she was a problem to be managed rather than an artist to be collaborated with. The footage from The Prince and the Showgirl is part of the public record, and Monroe's performance in it is, by most critical assessments, considerably better than Olivier's. That gap between the quality of the result and the experience of producing it was something Monroe felt with a sharpness that the people around her found both entirely understandable and genuinely painful to witness. Joe DiMaggio is an entry on this list that requires immediate and careful qualification, because the relationship between Monroe and DiMaggio was one of the most emotionally significant of her life. A marriage of 9 months followed by a complicated, persistent connection that lasted in various forms until her death. DiMaggio loved Monroe with a possessiveness and a consistency that was in some ways the most reliable form of devotion she ever received, and her feelings about him were never simple or uncomplicated. But the specific quality of DiMaggio's love, its possessiveness, its inability to accommodate the public dimensions of her professional life, its insistence on a version of her that was private and contained, rather than public and expansive, was genuinely damaging to Monroe in ways that she understood more clearly over time. DiMaggio found her sexuality, as expressed in her professional work, essentially intolerable. The famous photograph of her standing over the subway grate during the filming of The 7-Year Itch, her skirt billowing upward, was taken with DiMaggio present, and his response to watching the scene being filmed in front of a crowd of photographers and onlookers was an eruption of anger that Monroe found both publicly humiliating and privately revealing about what their marriage was and was not capable of being. She left him after 9 months. The specific reasons she gave people close to her involved not just the particular incidents, the violence that some accounts suggest accompanied his jealousy, the controlling quality of his attention, but the more fundamental incompatibility between his vision of what she was supposed to be and her own understanding of herself. He wanted a private woman. She was constitutionally, professionally, and in her own deepest self-understanding, a public one. His inability to accept the fullness of who she was produced a hurt and an anger that she expressed privately with a vehemence that people who heard her during those years found striking given the genuine attachment she also clearly felt. Arthur Miller's inclusion on this list carries the same complicated quality as DiMaggio's, because he was also someone Monroe genuinely loved and who genuinely hurt her in ways whose full dimensions only became clear over time. Miller was the serious literary figure, the playwright of Death of a Salesman, and the crucible, the intellectual whose presence in Monroe's life was supposed to be evidence of the seriousness that the world refused to grant her on her own. Their marriage in 1956 generated enormous press coverage and was read by many observers as either the most improbable coupling in recent cultural history or the clearest possible demonstration of Monroe's genuine inner life, depending on how seriously those observers took her. The specific source of Monroe's deepest hurt in the relationship with Miller was discovered when she came across his diary during the production of The Prince and the Showgirl and read his private assessment of her, an assessment that reflected a disappointment and a condescension that was considerably at odds with the public version of his feelings about her. He had written about her in terms that suggested he found her difficult and insufficient in ways he had not disclosed to her directly, and the experience of reading that private account was, by the descriptions of people close to Monroe during that period, genuinely devastating. She had married him partly because she believed he saw her as she actually was, as the intelligent, serious, artistically committed person she understood herself to be, and the diary entry was a window into a different private reality. His subsequent writing, including the screenplay for The Misfits, which he wrote with her in mind, but which contained a female character of notable fragility and psychological limitation, compounded the original wound in ways that people who knew Monroe during the last years of her life describe as something she never fully processed or set aside. Daryl Eth. Zanuck was the head of 20th Century Fox during the years when Monroe was under contract there, and his relationship with her reflects the specific kind of institutional power that the studio system of that era exercised over the people it owned, because owned is not too strong a word for the relationship between a major studio and an actress under contract during the classical Hollywood period. Zanuck had a specific understanding of what Monroe was and what she was useful for, and that understanding was built entirely on her commercial value as a sexual commodity rather than on any assessment of her actual abilities as an actress. The contempt embedded in this understanding was real and had real consequences for Monroe's professional life at Fox. She was cast in roles that required her to be decorative and sexually available in ways that she found both artistically limiting and personally demeaning, and her attempts to exercise creative agency over her career to pursue roles that would allow her to demonstrate range and seriousness were consistently rebuffed by a studio hierarchy that had no interest in the version of Monroe that she actually wanted to be. The development of Marilyn Monroe Productions in 1954, her own production company established in partnership with photographer Milton Green, was in significant part a direct response to the institutional contempt that Zanuck's Fox embodied, an attempt to create a professional structure in which she had genuine agency over her own image and her own creative choices. Monroe's private assessments of Zanuck, as described by people who knew her during the Fox years and beyond, were pointed and specific in ways that went beyond simple professional frustration. She understood, with the clarity that comes from sustained experience of a specific kind of institutional treatment, that his vision of her had nothing to do with who she actually was and everything to do with what she could be made to produce commercially. That understanding was not simply an intellectual position for her. It was a wound, renewed by each encounter with the specific ways the studio system treated her as a resource rather than a person, and Zanuck was the most concentrated embodiment of that system in her professional life. The contracts, the casting decisions, the public statements about her abilities and her professional conduct, all of it reflected a coherent institutional worldview in which she was a product to be managed rather than a person to be respected. She was intelligent enough to see it clearly and powerless enough for long enough that the scene, without being able to change it, produced a specific kind of accumulated anger that people close to her describe as one of the most consistent emotional facts of her professional life at Fox. Billy Wilder directed Monroe in both Some Like It Hot and The 7-Year Itch, and his public assessments of her across his career were among the more extensively quoted examples of behind-the-scenes Hollywood commentary from that era. He acknowledged her screen talent consistently and sincerely. He was too intelligent and too serious as a filmmaker to pretend that what she did on camera was anything other than extraordinary. But his accounts of the experience of working with her were colored by a frustration and an impatience that Monroe found in its specific expression genuinely hurtful rather than simply professionally abrasive. The specific quality that Monroe found most difficult in Wilder's treatment of her was the way his frustration expressed itself publicly, in interviews, and in statements that reached the press and that shaped the public narrative about her as a professional. Wilder was someone whose wit was celebrated, and whose acerbity was considered part of his charm, and the specific anecdotes he offered about Monroe's inability to deliver lines and her disruption of production schedules were told with a quality of amused exasperation that positioned her primarily as material for his storytelling rather than as a person whose experiences deserved a different kind of consideration. Monroe's response to this, as described by people close to her during the later years of her career, when Wilder's accounts of their work together were in wide circulation, involved a hurt that went to something fundamental about how she felt she was seen by the industry. Wilder's version of her difficulties was not simply critical, it was dehumanizing in a specific way, reducing the complexity of what she was dealing with to the raw material of an entertaining story about a difficult colleague. She had spent her entire career fighting for the right to be seen as a full human being, rather than as a category, and finding herself transformed into a Wilder anecdote was an experience of that reduction that she found both predictable and genuinely painful. Marilyn Monroe died in August 1962 at the age of 36, and the decades since her death have produced an enormous quantity of analysis, speculation, mythology, and projected feeling about who she was and what her life meant. Very little of that vast body of work has been primarily interested in what she actually thought, what she actually believed, and what she actually felt about the specific people who populated her professional and personal life. The myth is easier to sustain without those details, because the details are complicated and the myth is simple. But the specific dislikes on this list are not separate from the rest of her story. They are continuous with it, expressions of the same core reality that all the most honest accounts of her life converge on. She was intelligent, she was perceptive, she was capable of identifying with remarkable accuracy the difference between people who saw her and people who were looking at the projection they had made of her. The people on this list were, in different ways and through different specific actions, people who failed that test, who chose the projection over the person, the commodity over the artist, the anecdote over the human being. Her response to that failure was not simply suffering. It was specific, articulated in the terms available to her, and rooted in a clear understanding of what she deserved and what she was being denied. That clarity, sustained across a life that gave her every reason to lose it, is the most honest measure of who she actually was, and it deserves to be part of the record of her life as fully and as seriously as the myth that has accumulated in its place.